So good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of our 3-part series, Dissociative Adaptations to Developmental Trauma, Understanding, Recognizing, and Intervening. I'm Tracy Kite. I was here the first time, but not here the second time. So I want to, first of all, send a shout out to the Spungen Foundation for their financial support of this training. And their understanding that we all need to be better trained in trauma work. Sorry, I just lost my notes. Okay. So once again, handouts will be emailed after the training. As many of you have discovered, Dr. Stolbach sort of edits out the ones that have videos and things like that and doesn't include them. We will be doing the evaluation at the end of this session. I will put it in the chat as we get near the end. One of the things that I think we did not specifically ask about in the evaluation is how you liked the 3-part session, that we broke it up in this way. So that as we think about whether we want to do that going forward or not, your feedback is much appreciated. I believe there is a question in there that asks about future training on trauma. We have scheduled, although it's not out anywhere, I just confirmed with the speaker, a 2-part training, again, 90 minutes each, on treating clients with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have experienced trauma. And we are also looking at an additional training on treating adults and probably another one on treating children. So, just gauging interest in that. Wanted to let you know that there is a training on April 5th for working with families who are impacted by addiction. It'll be a panel. I think it's going to be really, really good. I've been working with the presenters. That is on our website and should be going out again in a constant contact email very soon. Let's see. We don't take a break. Please put questions in the chat, although I think Dr. Stolbach, so we're working on time here. So if you would hold questions that aren't absolutely mandatory, I think that would be helpful, or drop them into the chat. There have been resources at the end of every PowerPoint, and I'm not going to read the bio because you all know it by now. We will be sending out CEU certificates. I would say give us a couple of weeks because some of you have missed sessions, and so the number of CEUs on individual people's certificates is going to have to be sort of individually figured out. And that is enough from me. Please feel free to enjoy and put questions in the chat, and let's learn. Dr. Stolbach, take it away.
Thank you, Tracy. And so did everybody get the article about the treatment of the burn patient? Tracy?
Everyone, it was emailed to everyone.
Okay.
I'm seeing, well, mostly cameras are off, so I'm not seeing any response from people.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thumbs up.
We received it.
Okay. So hopefully people had a chance to take a look at that. The idea for today is that I'm going to spend about the first half of the time talking about assessment and therapy from a more theoretical perspective, with some examples, and some of the examples will actually be from that case. And then we'll have you split up into discussion groups and talk about the article and thoughts, questions that you had about it, thoughts you had when you read it about other cases of yours, and then we'll come back together and discuss some questions that came out of that small group discussion. So that's the plan for the structure for today. And Sarah, maybe if there's anyone on here that didn't get it, you could just put it into the chat and then they can download it from there. All right, so we left off last time and we saw a video about Manny. And that's a video that is available on the website of the Northwestern Center for Child Trauma Assessment Services and Intervention. And there are a lot of resources that go along with that video. So if you do any of training yourself or you're interested in using it, it's all available on there. I thought we would start today with any thoughts that people had about that video. And in particular, if you had ideas about the way that the therapist at the end approached him and the things that he said about nothing helps, I've tried everything, I've tried all the meds, I've tried. If you had thoughts about that related to your own work or related to the way that the therapist portrayed in the video approached Manny.
I guess I like that she normalized it for him and kind of said, like, we can figure it out together, but there is a reason, and the more you'll understand, you'll get better. Because I feel like often when the trauma clients come in, they feel like crazy or like they don't understand or they're just so broken or whatever. And so I like that she normalized it, but then also told him that he can help himself.
Yeah, great.
It was more of a empathic tone around what has happened to you, as opposed to let's look at all the behaviors that have been defining your identity to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Yep. Other ideas?
I think she also just laid out initially that we're going to work as a team right away, putting that out there. You and I are going to do this together. We're going to get through this together. So just that opening and trying to establish the bond and the rapport right away.
Yeah.
Very empathetically, I agree with Geneva.
So those are, all three of those comments are right on, and I think really important. And so as I talk about how to approach assessment and therapy, there are a few things that in what you just said and in what is shown in that video very briefly that are true for me of all the work you're doing, no matter who you're doing it with, and that make trauma informed or trauma focused work different from what a lot of our clients have experienced in other places. And so that is as you've said, that question of what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, and that what's going on with you makes sense. And we're going to try to work together to understand how it makes sense. And the focus is not on all of the reasons that people said you have to go talk to this person. Because a lot of times, especially with young people, they're not there because they said, oh, let me go find a therapist, right? They're there because somebody has had it. They're at the end of their rope. They don't know what else to do. And they're like, somebody's got to, figure this out. Or it's you're in trouble. And so you got to go talk to this person. And so it's as you said, that working together, this is not the therapist's agenda. This is not the agenda of the person who made you come here, right? The agenda is to work together to figure out how you can get what you need out of this work. And I think even for very young children, it's a very important way to approach the work. And that's not to exclude caregivers or to give them less power than they actually have, but to really center the child as the client and the child's experience as what is important. Any other thoughts about that before I get into my more didactic pieces for today? Okay. Don't know what I just did. Okay. So I know I've shown this and I'm starting off with it again. These are the messages that you want to try to be sending to your clients, sometimes very directly and explicitly, and sometimes through the way that you relate to them. Number one, it's not happening now. The trauma's over. Whatever trauma has been identified, whatever they've been through, whatever suffering they've experienced, it is in the past. That doesn't mean that it doesn't affect them, that they don't have a lot of pain related to it, or a lot of realistic worries about other trauma that they may be facing. But what is in the past is in the past, and your client and you are here in the present. Number two, you're safe. And that is about being safe in the moment, in that relationship. It's not about the broader safety. A lot of times people are like, well, they're not safe because there are people getting shot up on their block. You know, a lot of the people we work with, there are people looking to kill them. But the safety in the moment is something that a lot of our clients don't ever feel. So it's about that safety and about the responsibility for your safety is on me as the therapist or as the adult here, because you're worthy of care and protection. You're not inherently dangerous or toxic. And this is really important if you're doing any kind of talk therapy about what people have experienced. What is inside you, your thoughts, feelings, dreams, impulses, etc., cannot hurt you or others. I am not going to be destroyed by knowing and experiencing what's inside you with you. You are good. And this seems like very simplistic, and it is. But is the opposite of what a lot of our young people hear about themselves all the time, particularly at the point that they're being made to come talk to us. So whatever you've experienced, whatever you've had to do to survive, you're a good, strong person who can contribute to your community. And number five, you have a future. So a lot of people push back on the "you are good" thing because they're like, well, but they're bad. And you know, they're doing all these bad things. We don't want to encourage them, you know, hurting people or whatever it is that gets them in trouble. And my response to that is almost everyone is good. There are a few people who are very, very bad. And some of those people are very powerful and famous, and we know who they are, but most people are good. And so if you happen to have one of the few ones that's really bad, you telling them that they're good probably isn't going to make any difference, right? But if you're giving people the message that they're not good, that's gonna actually make things worse. So I just go with the default that they're good and that they need to hear that. So all of these messages really are, in a lot of ways, what matters in the work that you do. And then, some of what we'll be talking about today is particular techniques or approaches or goals for therapy that you have. But ultimately, it's about having a relationship with the child, the young person, where they can feel and maybe believe these things about themselves and their lives. Okay, so I don't know why my slides aren't, so there. So it's some general things in terms of how we approach our work about how to help a child affected by complex trauma. Communicate and understanding that the child is not responsible for the violence and maltreatment they've experienced. A lot of our kids don't feel like children. They feel like they're grown and they feel like they have adult responsibility for all the things that have gone wrong in their lives. That's not true. Have a relationship that serves the child's needs instead of yours. Very often they have not had adults who are prioritizing what they need. Have a relationship that is not solely about the child's experience of trauma. And that's really important for what we're talking about today, because what we're talking about today is really about everything being about the trauma and making sure that we focus on the trauma. And the reason for that is because the tendency for everyone, our clients and ourselves, is to not go there. And there's always lots of other things that we can do instead. And so if we're not really proactive about addressing the trauma, we're not going to do it. But we always have to remember that they are much more than their trauma, and that defining them, and a lot of our clients come in defining themselves this way, defining them as these horrible things that have happened to them is not helpful. And that related to that, see the whole child, not just what he or she has been through. Advocate for trauma-informed services outside of the work that you're doing. Remain calm when confronted with horrifying information. So we have to think about, how do we manage our own affect in relation to the trauma that we're addressing. Be a historian for the child. A lot of our kids, especially a lot of the kids you work with, they have not had anyone that's been in continuous relationship with them from the time they were born until today. And oftentimes they've had multiple caregivers, they've had multiple homes, and no one has kept track of anything. There are people who don't know, like 50% of this kid's life, they don't know. And so any history taking and history keeping that you can do, and that you can help them to have their own sense of how their life looks in continuity, extremely helpful. And that's extremely helpful, especially for people who are highly dissociative, because that's not even just like years, but day to day, moment to moment almost. Facilitate information sharing across systems. The more that people are working together to try to provide the same kinds of supports, the more effective it's going to be. And communicate that the child is worthy of love, protection, and care. I've already said that multiple times. Okay, so yes, Tracy.
So for people on the call who are also working with adults with trauma,
Yes.
can you speak to that a little bit before we move off of that previous section?
Okay, so is there something specific in terms of the things I've
No,
said, or?
everything that you've articulated has been very child specific. So I
Yes.
didn't know if there were things that would be different when working with an adult.
Got you. Okay. So I actually don't think so. I mean, I think that adults with complex trauma by definition have had these same kinds of struggles for a very long time, right? And so the messages are the same. The way that we convey those messages and the way that we try to address what they've been through is different for kids of different ages and different for adults as well. As we're in the discussion part of today, I certainly would welcome questions that people have or situations that are with clients of any age. So it doesn't have to be just about kids. But for me, the goals are not different. So we're not going to have a discussion about this in the interest of time, but I would like people to think about, like, what are the goals of child family therapy or individual therapy with adults, and what are the goals of trauma-focused therapy? And if they are different, how are they different? And do you think about these questions in your work, or is it all sort of second nature to you, and you just do your thing? So so in terms of working with dissociation and complex trauma, these are the main goals. And we're going to go through a lot of different sort of lists now of what people say are the core components or the core goals of therapy. They're all the same. They're just, some people use different words for different things. But there are some things that I think are true across different approaches and across different kinds of intervention. So number one, establishment of safety, both in and outside of therapy. Healing injuries related to history of attachment disorganization, disruption, or loss. Creation of an integrated narrative focused on the child's experience of traumatic events through talking, playing, writing, drawing, etc. Integration of the aspects of the child's personality, self, or experience that have been split off. Educating caregivers, and if you're working with adults, other people in their lives, about symptoms and their meaning, as well as how best to intervene when symptoms occur. Working with family, school, and others in the child's life to support the child's progress and adapt to changes as the child heals. As kids let go of some of their more challenging behaviors, that can be a big adjustment for other people in their lives as well. And so we always have to help people figure out, okay, now things are going to be different. How do I support that as opposed to fighting against it? So I told you to read this book, The Child Survivor by Joy Silberg. This is Joy's acronym for intervention and what we do in intervention. And it spells educate, because it's a good acronym. So educate about dissociative processes, dissociation motivation, meaning understanding what is driving it. Why does the person need to use dissociation, and for what? Understand what's hidden. Claim as own affects of shame, fear, sexuality, anger, and everything else too. Affect regulation and attachment both start with A, so they're both in there with the A. And they're also closely related, as we talked about. Triggers and trauma, we've talked a lot about that. And ending stage of treatment. Read the book. And this is also from Joy. She has these different kind of buckets for intervention and how to think about intervention. And so there are grounding interventions like sensory tools, a frozen orange, a koosh ball, things like this to help people stay grounded in the present. New behavior interventions, calming interventions, and awareness interventions. So you can think about the different things you're doing as serving one of these different approaches. The title of the book is The Child Survivor. Okay. Okay, so these are approaches that we use in our programs. It doesn't mean these are the only approaches, but there are others that are just as helpful. Some of it depends on how you approach psychotherapy and what you are comfortable doing and what works for you and your personality. I do not adhere to any one approach. I think that it's not a good thing that our field has done to say that there's this hierarchy of evidence and that you have to do evidence-based things with fidelity to those evidence-based things, because what fidelity has become is not fidelity to the ideas, but fidelity to a manual. And that the effect of that is essentially removing most of the tools that you have available to you, because you're only supposed to use the ones that are in the manual. And that's dumb. So I think it's important for us to be trained in different modalities and to learn from people who know what they're doing and who've spent their lives developing interventions that work. But I don't think we should use that to limit ourselves and limit our clients. So there's a list here, and if people have questions about any of these different kinds of approaches, I'm happy to address those later. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, many years ago now, actually had a complex trauma work group, and they put out a white paper, which you can find on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website. But they came up with these core components of complex trauma treatment. And those are safety, self-regulation, self-reflective information processing, trauma experience integration, relational engagement, and positive affect enhancement. Trauma experience integration is a big one and a very important one in both ways. And what I mean by that is we have people who only want to do that at the expense of everything else. And we have people, and those people tend to be more in the cognitive behavioral, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral kind of camp. Like, we're going to do these other things a little bit so that we can do the trauma, talk about the trauma. And there are other people, and those people tend to be more like my friends, the people who are more on the complex trauma side of things, who want to do all this other stuff and say that, you know, talking about the trauma isn't, you know, we're over that. Like, we don't need to do that. Actually, Bessel van der Kolk is famous for saying that a lot. I think Bessel van der Kolk is brilliant and has contributed lots of things to the field, but I think he's actually wrong about that. And I've told him that. So it's ultimately one of the major goals of all the work that we do is to try to integrate the experience of trauma in all its aspects. Okay, so I'm not going to do this because we don't need to. Okay. Child-parent psychotherapy is a approach to complex trauma with little ones that shares a lot with these kinds of interventions, but I wanted to just talk about the core elements of that, which overlap with a lot of what we said already. Providing reflective developmental guidance, providing assistance with problems of living, helping caregiver provide physical safety, helping caregiver provide emotional safety, constructing a joint trauma narrative, attending to families' cultural norms and values, collaborative engagement with the family, and reflective supervision. And you could take individual therapy and say almost exactly the same things, you just wouldn't use the word caregiver. So some of the jobs that we have as therapists, normalizing symptoms and providing psychoeducation about symptoms, linking the past and the present, supporting attachment behavior systems, capacity for co-regulation, developing strategies for managing triggered dysregulation inside and outside of therapy, facilitating the identification of affect, facilitating communication about affect through language and nonverbal means, holding information and using it to create a coherent narrative or narratives of the traumatic past, and helping others to understand and support the client. So those are a lot of things that we've already said. And again, this is not to discuss, but to think about which of those jobs are easiest for you, which are most difficult, what gets in the way of you doing these jobs, and what do you end up doing instead. So in talking about intervention, which we're going to do like very quickly, you start with assessment, some kind of assessment. And part of what I'm going to talk about is how assessment is part of a therapy process. And even if you're doing an assessment and someone else is going to do the therapy, there are ways that that assessment process can be therapeutic and can kind of line things up for the next steps in therapy. Things that are challenging about assessment with dissociative kids or complex trauma, that we don't have as well-developed ways of assessing traumatized dyads, disorganized attachment, dissociation, and trigger dysregulation as we may some other things, and also to be able to do those things across domains. The lack of sufficient time and resources to adequately assess all domains, difficulties with application of assessment information to treatment planning. So when you're doing assessment, the part of that is, why am I doing it? And the purpose of the assessment should be to inform how you're going to approach treatment, what needs to be focused on, and what to do first, what to do later, etc. So in assessment and in the feedback process, so assessment itself is most useful if it is part of an ongoing conversation, right? So if we just assess and we decide this is what our assessment means, and now we're going to do X, Y, Z, but we don't communicate with our clients about that, we're losing a big opportunity. And so the idea is that whatever understanding we get from an assessment process that we go through, we're sharing that understanding with our clients, and trying to have them either agree with it, disagree with it, correct it, and also understand something about themselves maybe differently. Normalizing trauma reactions. This is, it was said already today, but it's one of the most important things we do, and it's very easy to do. But that is to let people know that they're not crazy, that the kinds of reactions that they're having, the things that are giving them trouble, they make sense. They're normal. They're common. Lots of people go through them. One of the things that's like so common is anniversary reactions. People have anniversary reactions and they don't even know it's the anniversary of something that happened to them. And so to point that out, it's like, oh, well, whenever somebody's all of a sudden having a rough time, that's the first question I ask. When did the whatever trauma, when did it happen? Because our bodies know when it's the anniversary of something and they have reactions. Beginning the process of desensitization right from the beginning, which is to name the fact of the trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be talking about the trauma all the time, but to name in some way whatever experiences have kind of brought the person to where they are, right? Come up with shared language for that. Communicate that it's possible to talk about trauma without being totally overwhelmed. Begin the process of education about symptoms. Explain the process of treatment, how we're going to do what we're going to do, why, and give the child and family hope that things will improve. I always tell people that this is going to help. I never tell them it's going to fix everything, right? But I do tell them that it will get better. And some of that will be hard, right? So assessment, you want to include caregivers and children and have information from multiple angles. I've talked about a lot of this already. Joy talks about these 5 classes of dissociative symptoms: shifts in consciousness, hallucinatory experiences, marked shifts in behavior, mood, knowledge, memory lapses, abnormal somatic experiences. Auditory hallucinations, voices are the most common reported symptom in people who are traumatized. So a lot of our kids who share the fact that they have voices get labeled with psychosis. And that's not helpful. So it's important to not be alarmed when you hear that there are voices, or to make assumptions about what they mean, and to get more information about what exactly they're meaning when they say that there are voices. So in dissociative kids, these are things that you want to be sure to assess for. In addition to PTSD, trance states, amnesia, imaginary playmates sometimes are about dissociation, identity alteration, changes of state, somatic symptoms, lots and lots of somatic symptoms in traumatized people, sexually reactive or sexual offending behavior, and self-injurious behavior. I'm not going to go through that. These are some of the tools that we use. This is a tool that I developed, which I'm happy to share with folks. It's the Children's Dissociative Experiences Scale and Post-Traumatic Symptom Inventory, which is not a good name for a measure. It doesn't spell anything. It's not an acronym, whatever. This is a self-report that tries to get a sense of how much is this child struggling with dissociative kinds of reactions and responses, and also PTSD kinds of things. And a lot of the measures that we use with kids are not self-report in this way. They're more other people talking about them, or kids just like saying, I feel bad, or I don't feel bad. So anyway, I'm happy to share it. It's in the article that you were given for today. An example of voices a traumatized child might experience. Yes, so if oftentimes the voices are things that are about the kid's self-worth, that they're bad, that they're, they deserve to be hurt, they're stupid, voices that are, warning them that something bad is going to happen to them, threats, those sorts of things, voices that are in some way a re-experiencing of trauma that the child has been through. So hopefully that's helpful. And we can talk more about that later as well. Okay, so you read about Sam. We went through this assessment process. A lot of different tools were used, including this one. These are the things he endorsed on that tool. So highly dissociative kid, his mom was also reporting. A lot of times you get real disparate reports from caregivers and kids about these kinds of symptoms because a lot of them are going on inside the child. And it's unusual to have this level of agreement sometimes. And so it spoke to the attunement and the closeness that they had between them. But as you probably, if you read the article, you see that was a kind of double-sided thing that was helpful in some ways, in other ways it was part of the problem. Okay, so assessment, that's assessment. Very, very briefly. Again, the purpose of assessment is partly so that you can give feedback and talk about your understanding of where they're at and what you're going to do with them or what you're recommending. So part of that ongoing therapy process is that assessment and feedback. And really, all therapy for me is about this same thing, which is our goal is not to fix problems. Our goal is not to tell people how to be different. Our goal is to understand their experience, understand how their experience makes sense and how what they're doing makes sense, and to share that understanding with them in a way that they also understand and that can be used together to figure out what to do to make it better. So that's true for the assessment process, and it's true for all therapy as well. So we approach almost all the therapy we do as phase oriented. And so you think about these phases, and this really comes out of Judy Herman's work in trauma recovery. There are basically 3 phases of treatment. There's a phase that's focused on the present and what's happening in the present, symptom stabilization, skills training, getting things settled down enough that you can move on to something else. And then you move into a focus on the past. So you start in the present, then you move to the past, which is largely about creating some kind of integrated narrative of the experience of the life of the trauma. And that usually starts out on the periphery of trauma. And before we can do that, there are a lot of things that we need to do to get ready to do that. But even before you're doing that in a kind of structured way or intentional way, you're going to be getting little bits and pieces of the trauma story. And so part of your job is to capture that stuff as you learn about it. And so it's good to have, even before you've started a formal kind of narrative process with your client, to have your own kind of narrative. And if you start writing their story as you're getting these little bits and pieces, it's going to help a lot later. Some people have this idea that like everything has to be generated by the client. Like they have to tell the story and they have the beginning and the middle and the end. And that's not actually how it goes most of the time. And so what matters is making meaning of it and getting at the truth of what they've been through. And it's not like a test that they're taking. You know what I mean? Okay, so telling the story, usually it's just the facts. And so we try to capture the facts, and then we want to facilitate expression of thoughts and feelings related to those facts. And there's different ways that we can do that. Drawings, using computer, putting emojis in. Pictures are always very helpful. As you saw in that article, integration of all aspects of the experience, that's really what we're trying to do throughout, and particularly those things that are missing, that are hidden, that are not easily accessible. So you always want to be looking for like what's missing. What did we leave out? Because those are the things that are going to be causing the most trouble. Grief work is a really important part of trauma work that, again, a lot of us like to avoid. Like we want to help them with their, phobic stuff. Like we want to get them back in there, get back to that place, and be able to do the things you need to do. But we don't really want to be sad, and we really don't want to face the parts of it that are really the most tragic. But if nobody does that with them, then they're not going to have the chance to do it. So grieving for what people have lost through their trauma does not erase the things that they've gained or the strengths that they have. It's a really important piece. Okay, so we can talk about that stuff later. We talked about her. Okay, so then, you go from that kind of integration of the traumatic experiences to more, with people who have complex trauma or dissociative difficulties, identification of dissociated aspects of the self. And so that means psychoeducation about that, acceptance of disavowed parts of the self, building connections between different aspects of the self that are dissociated. And you will recall this from the article, if you read it. This is some of the work that Sam did around this. And then, of course, all this happens very quickly. You've done like maybe 4 sessions now, and now you're on to session 5 where you're terminating. That was a joke for people who might take me seriously. People who've been traumatized for a really long time need a really long time to recover from that. Most of our kids who've had this kind of trauma have had literally years nonstop of being traumatized. So the idea that we can do some manualized thing for 3 months and now they're good to go is another kind of stupid idea that we have. So this is work that takes a long time, and we have to be honest about that. And if there are parts of the work that can't be done, then maybe they can be done later, but we need to be clear with people about that fact, that here's what we did and here's what we didn't do. And so in termination, it's all of that. It's kind of recapping, what did we do and how was it helpful and why, and also saying goodbye. And saying goodbye means talking for real about the relationship that you have and about the feelings that you have for each other. And why. And so that's another part we don't like to do. We don't like to say goodbye. It's hard and it's sad, and but it's one of the most important things that we do in our therapy relationships. So I know that was all very, very fast. And that was because I promised that we would have time to talk today. So the idea now is that you're going to break up into groups, right, Tracy? So you're going to put them in groups?
You're going to be
Okay.
dropped into breakout rooms.
And this is for you to talk about the article, to talk about what we've talked about, to talk about your own clients that you've thought about over these 3 sessions. And as a group to come up with, like, this is one thing we'd really like to hear about. This is one question, whether it's about something in the article or whether it's about some work that you're doing currently. This is one thing we'd really like to hear what Brad has to say about this, or we'd really like to hear what other people in this group have to say about it. And then come back and pick, as your group, pick one thing that you would like for us to talk about together. And Aviva, you have your hand up.
I do. So the one thing that on the first session you said you were going to talk about was the idea of when you have a client who comes in with other diagnoses, but really their trauma, like how you can identify like what's trauma and what's not. And I feel like based on what you said today, I don't have clarity on that, and it could totally be me. So I don't know if that's what we're supposed to talk about in group work, or if you can like, if there is a couple like of very identifying things that I would be able to do to be able to help me, or an article or something, because I feel like I'm still confused, not confused, I guess is definitely the right word.
Mhm.
And I feel like I have clients that come in and I'm not sure what their real story is. And it's not like one trauma of like, oh, I know they're here because they got in a car accident, they saw death, they had a fire. Like they're here because they're having tons of problems in school and family relationships, and they're rolling their eyes and angry at me and not reactive and like, help. Like, I guess I'm trying to figure out is, you know, how to go about being able to better assess that.
Yep. So let's start with that question when we come out of our groups. And you should talk about it in your group too. How's that? Aviva gets the first question. All right, bye. So Aviva's question, which actually, and somebody put in the chat, they want the link to the Northwestern video, which I will before we end today, or maybe Sarah, I don't know if you have that link, if you can put it in the chat. It's Remembering Trauma. If you Google Remembering Trauma NCTSN Northwestern, you should get to it. Okay, so the question was, when you're seeing somebody and you know they have all this trauma and they're coming because somebody says something else is the problem. Is that the question, Aviva?
Well, yes and no. Like, how do you identify if the child, let's say, has ADHD or has other diagnostic pathology that you really do need to treat and help, and it's a different amount versus someone who really has trauma that's presenting differently, and then you're treating them for the wrong thing.
Right. So I think I'm actually gonna go back to, if you don't mind. Okay,
The link to the videos in the chat.
great. So if you recall from that article, this kid had tons of problems, right? So he had been diagnosed with a separation anxiety disorder. He had an OT for sensory integration dysfunction. He had receptive language deficits. He had irritable bowel syndrome. He weighed 47 pounds and somebody thought he had an eating disorder. He had had therapy because his parents got divorced when he was 5 years old. And he had this very horrible trauma that never was addressed in any of the diagnoses he was given or any of the intervention. And I think this is true for many, many of our kids. And so I think, I mean, it's somewhat simplistic, but the way that it's handled in that video is actually what we do, which is to say, you know, you've been through a lot. And I work with a lot of people who've been through fill in the blank, whatever, right? People who've been, you know, fed into the child welfare machine and chewed up, and, you know, that many of them have a lot of the same struggles that you're having. And so where I always want to start is just trying to understand what all you're dealing with. And so where we start is asking about all the different kinds of trauma and adversity that people experience, and to do it in a very normalized way, that like we ask everybody these questions because it helps us to get an understanding of what might be creating some of the difficulties. And to do that in a way that it's not, you don't have to talk about the traumatic experiences. I think that's what happens. Like a lot of people will say, oh, I don't want to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it, right? We're going to ask you, like an ACEs survey. We're going to ask you just, have you experienced this? Have you experienced that? How old were you? Da, da, da. And if they start getting overwhelmed or they start talking about it, then we help bring them back to, you know, that's not going to be helpful right now to get into that. We will talk about it later. And to essentially frame things, and this is what I tell, like a lot of the people that I supervise, like, I don't care what it is, it's related to the trauma. So getting the connection to the symptom or the difficulty and linking it to what they've been through is something that you always want to do. And a lot of times we kind of forget to do it, or we just think everybody knows. So we don't say it out loud. So I think that the assessment process can be an important part of that. And what I hope that we have for the kids we're working with is something like the developmental trauma history profile that we have for Marie-Therese in the first session that we had, that we know here are all the different things this person's been through, here are the different ages they were, and we do a lot of normalizing of, wow, look at all that, like no wonder. And so we're gonna find ways to help with this issue or that issue. And like what I said to Sam with the burn was, yeah, you have all this trouble paying attention, you can't read. Like that was his big thing, I can't read. All the other kids can read, I can't read. If we can free up some of these resources that you've had to use to deal with keeping this trauma out of your mind, that's going to free up resources for you to be able to do the other things that you need to be able to do. It's not that you're not trying. It's not that you're a bad person. It's that you're busy and you've been busy surviving. And that doesn't leave you a lot of room for these other things. And I know it's kind of simplistic, Aviva, and I'm sorry, but every one of these questions is something we could talk for days about, which is the challenge always in this kind of a, like, here's what to do. But hopefully that was at least a little bit helpful. And I don't know if other people have thoughts about that. Anybody want to comment on Aviva's question?
And maybe we should offer to take another one.
Yep.
Other questions that came up in your group? Group 11's question. Possibility of further training for trauma-focused therapy with adults. Yes, there will be one more training on that. I know that we will be offering.
I have a question about infant trauma and how you would like talk about that with parent/child if you were then seeing the child as like a 5-year-old. And you, let's say the example would be you knew they were premature and separated from their parents for a lengthy amount of time due to being in the NICU. How would you work with that?
So that's a great question. And of course, the answer is it depends. That's the answer to everything. But there are a lot of traumas that happen before people have language, right? And before they have the parts of their brain that do all the cognitive stuff that most of our therapy is aimed at. And so they don't have verbal memories. They don't have memories in the way that we usually think about memories, but usually they have some understanding of things that they've experienced, might be very superficial, or there are ways that it's apparent in their body, right? And so the first thing is to try to figure out what they know about what happened or what they think about what happened, and then to figure out what questions they have that haven't been answered, and to then see if any of those questions are answerable. And so, we worked with a kid who his mother was murdered. He was almost 1 year old at the time. He was actually found with his mother's body at some period of time. So there was some period of time that he was there. He witnessed the murder, and then he was with his dead mother for some period of time. And he had been with a relative ever since, and was a really good attachment that he had. But he had a lot of difficulties, and one of the difficulties was that he was anoretic. And so we just did that. We were like, what questions do you have? Like, and then what questions could his caregiver answer, and what questions were not answerable, and then to really talk about how his body remembered that, right? And that his body maybe did things sometimes that were about what he had been through, what his body had been through. And then once we did that, he stopped being anuretic. So could have been a coincidence, but you know. Okay, who's got another? Tracy and Sarah, you'll have to pick what question are we going to go to next. And I don't know, the other people in the group, there are a lot of people here who do a lot of work with little ones. So other people might have thoughts about infant trauma as well that you want to contribute.
Are there hands? I'm going to go with one in the chat. How do you introduce dissociation to kids and families without over pathologizing? Language, metaphors.
So we don't make a big deal out of it, actually. So like the first, we work with kids who've been shot. A lot of kids have been shot. Almost the first thing that I talk to kids about after they've been shot is a lot of people after they've been through something like this have reactions in their body like their back, feeling like angry all of a sudden. They might, feel like they have to get away, all these kind of things. And when they have these kinds of feelings, a lot of time, they feel like they're going crazy. And it's not crazy. It's really common. It's really normal. And that after we've been through trauma, there's functioning like we're back there at the time when it happened. And then sometimes we're also like functioning like it never happened. So that theory of structural dissociation of personality. And so one of the things that's helpful is if you can have your brain remind your body that you're not there, right? And you can remember like, okay, that was Tuesday and today's Thursday. It can help your body to calm down. And so one of the things that helps with that is actually just breathing. And we teach them some deep breathing that they can do, like take a really deep breath in through your nose, blow it out real slow through your mouth. Sometimes people like to count to 10 while they're doing it. Take 2-3 breaths like that. It can help you to remember. And you're trying to help them remember they're not there. It's in the past. It's not happening now. You're here, you're in the present, and you're safe. So that's all about dissociation.
Okay. Do you find it important to try to begin with the earliest traumatic memory someone knows about? That was part of my EMDR training. Also, what do you think about something like EMDR as an adjunct to talk and play focused therapy?
So I am not trained in EMDR. I actually went to an EMDR training many years ago and I was like, I'm not doing this, and I left. And that's just because me. Like that's my problem, not theirs. I have people who are brilliant at doing EMDR, and I have tremendous respect for them. And EMDR and similar approaches are extremely helpful. There's no doubt. I found them helpful myself. I have family members who found them helpful. We always want simple solutions and shortcuts. And they don't actually exist. So if you're using EMDR like that, I think it's a problem. If you're using it as one component of really doing the kinds of work that we've talked about, great. There's definitely something to the two hemispheres of the brain and getting things moving in between them, and that bilateral stimulation, which is really what MDR does. And there are other approaches to EMDR that are not about eye movement, that are about bilateral stimulation. So I think that's great. It can't hurt. But I also think one of the reasons EMDR has been shown to be effective is that we all are tremendously avoidant of trauma. And so if you have this structure and you've been told this is what you do and you do it this many times and it's going to make it safe, now we can talk about the trauma. And so there's trauma integration work that's happening because the therapist now feels that it's safe to do it. So that's not to dismiss everything about EMDR, but I think that's an important piece of it. And the other thing I will say is almost anything we do, if we're thoughtful enough about it to write a manual and to do a random controlled trial of it, it's going to work. So there's a whole problem with the way that we think about evidence and evidence-based interventions. And that applies to EMDR and everything else as well.
Okay. I'm going to ask this one just because I think it's still pretty relevant. Can you share your thoughts on trauma work over telehealth?
Oh,
Well, that was short.
I hate this whole pandemic thing. I hate it. I don't know. I mean, I have trained. We started a postdoc 2 years ago, like right at the beginning of the pandemic. We've had four trainees so far in this postdoc. I'm like, I'm sorry. All I can say is I'm sorry. This is your fellowship. Like, it's not the same. Is there a lot we can do? Yeah. Do we get access to people who maybe never would have come before? Yes. Is it the same as being in the room with somebody? No. And with dissociation, I mean, you're already dissociated just because you're looking at a screen. So it's really hard. And I'm glad that it appears that we're going to be able to not do this all the time. But I think the things we've learned about doing telehealth from this terrible experience can complement the other work that we do, and it gives us another tool so that we have people who they're not going to come every session. They're just not, no matter what we do. And so maybe sometimes we do this other thing instead. Those are my thoughts about that.
Okay. So it is 10:30. So I want to formally close the session. I want to give my great appreciation to Dr. Stolbach for his sharing and his wisdom and his resources and knowledge and compassion and all of those things. I will have evaluations, and the link to the evaluation is actually in the chat. And we will have that feedback, but I know we've heard over the last few weeks just really, really positive feedback, which is wonderful. There is a link to the evaluation in the chat. I know that we have captured Dr. Stolbach for quite some time at the end of each session. I leave it to him as to what your availability is. Obviously, we have more questions in the chat, although we have lots of thank yous.
I'm free to stay around if people want to do that again. I will say, I think I mentioned this before. I don't know if I did. If I didn't, I'm sorry. But we have, as part of our program, monthly case conferences with Dr. Jana Presley, who is an ARC trainer, used to be here at Wheaton and has been in Boston, started at the Trauma Center before it closed, and is now part of the Complex Trauma Training Institute. And anyone who wants to participate in these monthly conference calls is welcome. If you
get that information to Sarah and I, and we will send it out with the last PowerPoint.
Yeah, so what I'll need to do is have people's email added to the list, because you'll get an email with the date and time. So I guess, I don't know, whatever you think.
We'll collect it.
Okay,
We'll give you a list. So when we send out the last PowerPoint, you will have a reminder that if you want to be added to the list to be invited to the monthly consultation. And do you know when it is?
it's on a Tuesday at 11, and I don't know.
At 11
It kind of
Eastern or
varies, 11 Central, and it kind of
Okay.
varies which week of the month it is. So,
Okay. And
but
how long
it's
is
usually
that?
one Tuesday a month. It's an hour.
Okay.
And there's usually somebody brings a case. I don't like the word presents, but they bring a case, and then they bring questions, and then there's a discussion. And usually Jana has a lot of ideas, and usually there are people on the call who also have ideas.
Okay, great. So we will ask you to reply if you want to be added, and then we will provide a list to Dr. Stolbach so that you don't have to have all of those emails coming, because we know how excited you are about email in general. Okay. So next question, if you are willing to take more questions, can you speak to helping differentiate between trauma-related behaviors and developmental behaviors, especially with young, i.e. e.g. preschool age children, for example, tantruming and fluctuating moods that can be normal for certain ages, but can also be part of a trauma. Thinking of it from the lens of helping parents respond to their child as they are processing through a trauma.
So the first thing I would say is, if you know that there's trauma and you know what it is, I always assume that that's what's driving the problem. And if I'm wrong, then we'll find out, because addressing the trauma won't fix the problem. And then you know that it's something else, right? So that's the first thing. Like that's how we start with everybody also, is assuming that, the most obvious explanation for why you're so upset is probably the right one. We don't have to get all scientific and make up mumbo jumbo and labels for things. So that's one. But you're right that there are many ways that difficulties that kids are having overlap with each other. So there may be things that are related to them being autistic or having other developmental kinds of differences that also are true for their trauma. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? And if we kind of hang our intervention on the trauma, sometimes that helps with caregivers to be more willing to do the thing that we're trying to do. So, and I do this a lot with like bedtime routines, and it's in the article about the nightlight intervention that we did with Sam, that it's not that you're a bad parent because you don't have a bedtime routine and you don't tuck your kid in and you don't say prayers a bit, whatever. It's that when people have been through trauma, it really helps them to have a consistent routine at bedtime. It helps with sleep disturbance. It helps with nightmares. It helps them to stop from coming in your bed in the middle of the night. So is it true that this kid's never slept through the night because they watch TV until 1 o'clock in the morning and that like they don't ever go to bed, they just fall asleep on the couch? Yes, that's true. Is that about their trauma? No. But if we can get them to do this thing that's going to help with it, because that's what traumatized kids need, then maybe they're going to, same thing with hitting them. Like, don't hit the kid. Don't hit your kid. Why? Well, you know, for other kids, it's okay. Kids who've had trauma, it really doesn't help. Makes things worse. I don't have to get into it whether corporal punishment is a horrible thing to do or not, because I'm not going to win that one. Feels good to the parent. They want to kill the kid, they just hit him. They feel better. They didn't kill him.
Okay. Let's see. How can you recognize dissociation versus acting out behavior faster? And how to piece together the dissociation instead of responding to the behaviors of the individual?
So before I answer that, I actually want to go back. Did I, in another session, did I talk about this film called Deej about nonverbal autistic man? Okay. Because that to the last question, there's a lot in there about how autism and developmental differences and PTSD and developmental trauma disorder are all kind of mixed together. Okay, so I'm sorry, Tracy, give me that one again.
Okay. Let's see. How can you recognize dissociation versus acting out behavior faster? And how to piece together the dissociation instead of responding to the behaviors of the individual?
So what happens before the behavior? That's always like, what, if you can identify triggers, or if you see any relationship between the behavior and the trauma, then that's how you want to approach it. So, and again, normalizing, and then trying to figure out, why is it happening, right? And so what are the alternatives also is a good question to ask yourself. So is the alternative explanation that there's some kind of, well, let me ask, what are the alternative explanations? Like, pick a bad behavior and tell me the other possible reasons that it could be happening that aren't trauma related.
And I think the person who asked this question has been having some trouble with their tech.
Okay.
I'm good right now.
But, I
I'm
mean,
good.
oh, there you're there. Awesome. Go.
I'm there. I guess because I work at Rice. So I guess one of the biggest things is us recognizing behaviors versus what is dissociation, and based upon the trauma part. In my group, we actually talked about a kid acting out and not wanting to take a bath, and you know what I'm saying, and just really recognizing that that may actually be something happening around water. So I use the example of the boiling water from the story. You know, the kid is afraid of water, you know what I'm saying? But we just look at it as kid has a problem, they want to do hygiene, they want to do everything else, you know what I'm saying? I gave that example. Another thing is just listen to everybody talk, and you talk right now. Currently, I have a client that is really struggling, and it's just, I'm looking at it yesterday as he just acting out, a lot of redirections, not like really challenging me, like beyond, you know. But I'm thinking like, there's something else going on currently. We have a lot of changes happening right now, and I didn't think about it, is how is these changes and people coming and going really affecting him? You know, it must be triggering something from his past. It's making him, as me being like the strong or the head of the unit. It's like it must be something that's making him trying to get something from me to comfort him. But that's not how I've been looking at it the last couple of days. I've been looking like it's driving me crazy.
Right.
You know,
Well, that's the hard part, right? Is that like they're pissing you off. I mean,
totally.
because I mean, if you go back to like what we talked about the, you know, disorganized attachment and this, you know, the persecutor, the rescuer, or the victim, right? Like, there's the different possibilities. So, you know, a lot of times our kids will go into this like they're going to hurt you. That's what they're about, or they're going to blame you for everything that they're upset about because they're being the victim. But I think going back to the way Joy Silver talks about it, what they're doing is keeping them from having to feel or know something else. Right? So if I can be pissed off all the time, or if I can have everybody pissed off at me, and then I can be pissed off that everybody's treating me bad, right? What am I avoiding? What do I get to not feel because I'm keeping everybody busy with this? And so I think it's trying to understand that, like, what is being avoided. And then again, like you were talking about different triggers, there probably are triggers and we don't see them, and they might not know those triggers. And so you can just break it down with them about triggers and you know, there's different kinds of things that can be triggers. And sometimes it's you know, something that happened that reminded you of a person, or something. It could be an anniversary, it could be, to kind of break down all these different kinds of things that can be triggers, and then just try to think with them together about, you know, whenever you have a tantrum, right? Like, let's try to take a look at what was going on before that, you know, and try to keep track of that. And it also goes back to this, you know, what I talked about earlier, like, they're not bad. Like, most likely they're not bad. They're, you know, I mean, I know some bad people, but most of them aren't these kids, you know? So that doesn't mean they can't do really bad. It's like they can do stuff that's really bad, but they already know that. They know that it's bad. Like, you know, the kids I work with, like, they know it's bad to kill people. Like, they're not doing it because they're bad. They're doing it because they're trying to survive. So, you know, trying to understand how it makes sense that they're doing it, even though it's bad.
Yeah. I think when we're in the moment, that's to be like the hardest part, to actually remove yourself, you know, which is the way that you can just constantly in the moment when things are happening, you know, instead of 2 or 3 days later, you're taking a step back, you're hearing somebody else talk, and then you're like, it's way deeper than what I'm reacting to, you know.
It's hard. It's hard. Like, the reason I became a psychologist is because I worked in residential treatment, and like, I heard kids. I mean, we were doing stuff that was not helpful and was harmful, because that's what we knew how to do. And a lot of times we were just reacting, right, and trying to control these kids. And I thought, you know, there has to be a better way. But you know, it's very hard, it's very challenging. And working with kids in a, any kind of milieu setting is really, really challenging. Because no matter what, you're starting at a baseline of they're pissed off because they're in this hellhole. You know, we're talking about working with kids who've been locked up or anything, like, you know, we torture these kids and then we're like, why are you acting like that? It's hard, especially if we're on the torture side. You know, we're on the side of the torturers.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, God bless you. I say that.
I wanted to add, I work at Rice too, and I think the difficulty that Curtis is describing is also experienced by foster parents and bio parents to some degree, because with relational trauma, it can be so confusing what the kid is trying to get. Like with kids, we understand goal-directed behavior. You know, how many times have I read in referral materials, like the kid is triggered by the word no. Everybody's triggered by the word no. But like the level of escalation is just mind-boggling to us. You know, the kid didn't get a piece of candy and they're trying to jump out the car window. Like, you know, we don't see what goes on in their brains from here to there, right? But I think that anyway, what I want to address is like that it's not just in residential centers that kids who've experienced such complex trauma, you know, act in such confusing ways. And I think it's that attachment piece. So the kid needs you and they're trying to get something specific from you, but then you try to give it to them and they act in a way that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think kids who've experienced trauma starting at early ages tend to act in these very confusing ways. And it's really hard for caregivers because we think, well, they're just trying to get their way. They're just being manipulative, you know, all these labels we put on their behaviors. It's really hard. We know it's trauma, but it's hard to see how this is connected to their trauma. Because it looks to me like it's about me telling them no.
Right.
So.
Right. I mean, ultimately, what you want is to have a relationship where you can start to talk about that, right? Like what it's really about. And I know that it's also about the thing. It's also about the fact that you said no, or it's not just about what's triggered, right? It's both. So I'll talk to kids about how there's extra, you know, when you've been through this kind of early childhood and you have all of these feelings about that, and then something else happens that's also very upsetting. Like you have all this extra stuff because your mom's locked up, you know, and so it's not that you don't have a reason to be mad about the thing, but the jumping out the car window, that's not about the thing, right? That's about how the thing got completely spun out of control by the trauma, which is what you're saying. I mean, I'm not saying anything really adding to what you're saying. I'm just agreeing. But there's, I mean, it's all that stuff is like some psychoeducation. You can think of it as psychoeducation. Like you're constantly making those connections and going back to how, yeah, this is how people who've been through this stuff deal a lot. There's a nice video that I didn't show by Dan Siegel, and you can find it on Google. It's just, if you look for, on YouTube, if you look for the hand model of the brain, Dan Siegel hand model of the brain, and he does this nice little explanation of how there's all this stuff down here and it comes up, and then you have the higher parts of your brain here that keep things managed and regulate, and then you flip your lid. And that's a nice kind of metaphor that works a lot for kids.
Right, I got one more. I'm curious how you incorporate caregivers who are either directly responsible for the trauma or somehow tied in closely, i.e. still very close to the perpetrator or of abuse. You know, a really easy one for the end.
I mean, we have terrible systems. Like, they don't make any sense. We tell kids that we're taking them away from their caregivers because that's the only thing that we could possibly do for them to be safe. And then they're not any safer. And we punish, we're interested in punishing people rather than trying to figure out what got them to that place where they ended up hurting. But I think one of the problems in our system is that it somehow makes the child and the child's functioning a decision point about whether or not they have contact with their parent who's been harmful to them. And that's not, like, whether you want to see your mommy is not a reasonable question to ask a child, but our system asks them all the time. How do you feel about it? They want their mommy. That's like, no matter what the mommy did. So we need to take that responsibility off of them. And then the real question is, can this caregiver be safe in whatever setting, in whatever context? When they're having contact with the child, can they be safe? Can they attend to the child's needs and prioritize that over their own? And what have they done to take responsibility for the harm that they caused and to take steps to ensure that they won't do it again? And these should be very concrete things that are easily understandable to the child. And if they're not, we're putting the child in a very, very difficult position. So that's my very simple answer to that question. And I'm curious, like, what you all think about what I said.
You know, I think one of the problems is that there are attorneys and other people involved in this, and talk about a risk avoidant they are. I spent years fighting with the guardian ad litem's office that parents needed a visit. We just needed to make sure that it was a safe visit. I worked at Hepzibah, and we did a lot of education of the judges in the court through testimony about what needed to happen to help this family get better. And took time. And if they wanted to run through something quickly, I'd say, I'm sorry, but I'm not through. Ask me. I have another few questions that I've asked the attorneys to ask me. So it's part of this is kind of owning your own power in these systems.
Yeah,
But it's really changed since, I can't believe we were talking a bit about the time you need to be able to sort through well all of what is happening, but you have 30 days to make a diagnosis, so insurance will pay for whatever you're doing. So you make the best call you can, and then you change it when you have more information. But the same is true with DCFS. I mean, I was talking to the staff about how little time they have to do any kind of stabilization. We take kids, we call it therapy sessions, but we take them for ice cream because they never did get out of, that's what Hepzibah did. We intervened with schools so schools didn't abuse the kids a second time.
Yeah.
But it's also having the time and the chutzpah to be able to do that, and also having the approval and the funding. Or frankly, a lot of that was on the workers' backs, because we
Mhm.
all worked crazy hours to make things happen. So it's kind of like, how do you fix a really broken world?
Yeah.
And I think I agree with you about that. It's very tough.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, I think that to be able to do those kind of visits is to really pull. A lot of it is helping people to understand that, I'm never going to let something stupid happen. And here's how I do that. And
Mhm.
because you really have to calm them all down.
Yeah.
And then take responsibility for anything stupid that happens.
Right.
It's like, it's okay, it'll be fine. Yeah, I have insurance. You can sue me. But
It takes so much time and resources. And then what if the answer is we need a clinically supervised visit?
we used to do clinically supervised visits, but
Yeah,
who does
but
those now?
but then you're working 80 hours a week.
I was, yeah, that
So-
was crazy,
It is. It's
Crazy.
very unhealthy. So I mean,
right?
but that's our system. And
Yep.
it's worse now, if you believe it.
It is totally worse now from what you all are talking about. Yeah.
It's horrible.
Well, and the system, there are many things driving these systems that have nothing to do with the people that are fed into them,
No.
right? And
Right,
so, the child welfare system is just as racialized as the prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
And there are reasons that it's set up that way, that go back hundreds of years. And so, there's this whole idea that the state is better at taking care of children than humans, is problematic. And then the idea that everything is binary. It's like they're good or they're bad. And there, just like I said, there are very few bad people. There are very few really just bad parents. I mean, there are some they're evil, but most of them are just completely traumatized and have no idea what they're doing, and they screwed up,
Yeah.
because they were little kids themselves.
And no one took any care of them.
Exactly.
Right. They were just repeating what happened to them. Yeah.
Yep.
Those were the midnight calls when the perpetrator would tell us, here's what I really did. Yeah, you're right. And
Yeah.
then you could totally understand, because his torture led to his abuse of his child.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're the easiest ones for the systems to blame. So we
Oh,
blame
easy.
the parents, cut them out, and then we have all these traumatized children that we don't know how to take care of.
Exactly.
And then we say, okay, now they're safe, so everything's good. Okay, now you're going to this wonderful home. Go.
Fantasy.
Ready? Go. And then you have these resource parents, they're called now, like we used to call them foster parents. We used to call them, substitute caregivers, whatever, adoptive parents. They're told, like, give them love and it'll be good. Just give them love and safety. Okay, good luck. And the fact that you're trying to put, this very complicated puzzle piece over here into this other puzzle piece that is not shaped anything like the one that you're plugging into it. And you keep trying to mash them together. Like, as a parent, that is really, really hard, because you feel like a failure all the time.
Yeah.
But nobody talks to them about that. Well, you do, but the system at large.
Well, you do, and you
Okay.
scare them away, and then you don't have any foster parents.
Right.
Well, but if it was approached that way from the beginning, like informed consent, then, you know, we probably
Agreed.
wouldn't drive so many away.
If you just told people the truth, that would make a big difference.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry that I didn't answer a bunch of questions that we could have talked about. But I've enjoyed working with y'all, and maybe some of you will come to some of our calls, and
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to do something in the future. Tracy, let me know.
You're muted, Tracy.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. And enjoy the sunny day if you can get out and do